So news out is that the United Kingdom and Australia are due to recognize a Palestinian state. And this is due to occur at the UN sitting in September. So I did a little bit of research on this, ladies and gentlemen, and as of March 2025, 147 of the 193 UN members officially recognized the Palestinian state. Now, the Palestinian state has then held observer status at the UN since 2012. Now, in 2024 alone, countries including Norway, Spain, Ireland, Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, Slovenia, and Armenia all granted formal recognition to a Palestinian state. So what's now gone on in the intervening period to mean that a new Palestinian state will be recognized by, at the time of recording, France, United Kingdom, Canada, Malta, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, France announced in July 2025 that it would formally recognize a Palestinian state. And in response to that, the United States had this to say.
Have you noticed that the talks with Hamas fell apart on the day Macron made the unilateral decision that he's going to recognize a Palestinian state? And then you have other people come forward, other countries say, well, if there's not a ceasefire by September, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Well, if I'm Hamas, I basically conclude, let's not do a ceasefire, because we can be rewarded and we can claim it as a victory. So those messages, while largely symbolic in their minds, actually have made it harder to get peace and harder to achieve a deal with Hamas. They feel emboldened.
Now, it's interesting to note that the U.S. highlighted that negotiations with Hamas on a peace deal ceased after France said that it would formally recognize a Palestinian state. Now, Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom was then under significant pressure to recognize a Palestinian state, but he suggested he would only do so if Israel failed to take steps which included increasing humanitarian aid and halting West Bank annexation. Australia then followed up and said that it would formally recognize a Palestinian state in September, but only under the condition that there was demilitarization in the zone, a recognition of Israel's right to exist, holding free and fair elections, and the exclusion of Hamas from governance. And I've got to say, none of that's going to happen. So I must be honest and say the entire debacle started getting me thinking, what exactly is this whole Israel and Palestine that they frequently reference?
Every single thing that you just said is untrue. The Jews were the original nation, hundreds and hundreds of years before Islam was even invented. Basically, the precursor of the United Nations, the League of Nations, decided that as a matter of international treaty obligation, the British would be given custodianship of Palestine called the Mandate, under which Britain would be under a binding treaty obligation to return the Jews to their ancestral homeland to recreate it. Now, what was Palestine at the time? Well, a bit of it, a very large chunk of it, was promptly given away to the Arabs by Winston Churchill to become Transjordan, which is now Jordan. So what did that leave as the territory within which Britain had a binding duty to return the Jews as a matter of historic right? What was that territory? It is what is now Israel, what is called the West Bank, and Gaza.
And to that, I found little to no historical analysis of the actual word of Palestine, although there's frequent recognition of the word Israel, and the noticeable peak of the idea of a Palestine seemed to really gain momentum around the 1950s when Israel beat the Arabs in the War of Independence. In fact, it's really important to recognize that the Palestine that is frequently referenced was obviously originally called Transjordan, which still exists today. It's called Jordan. That's where the majority of Palestinians live. Now, Jewish Palestine, now called Israel, was obviously a historical construct too. So who knows? But what I can say is that the idea that it is just pro-Palestinian marchers constantly going through the streets of London all the time chanting Free Palestine isn't really factual. In fact, if you look here, you'll see yourself that there are counter-protesters constantly occurring for Israel's right to exist and also for the return of the hostages. Have a look.
country and profound respect and admiration for our emergency services. You are the best among us, and we thank what you do. If we look at our lives since that awful and murderous day, much has happened.
Interestingly enough, I do notice that these type of videos are never actually shown in the legacy media, and one has to ask the question of why. Now, addressing the humanitarian issue, specifically around the AIDS in Gaza, we do notice that when you generally tend to ask people such as Bernie Sanders, a pro-Palestinian person, whether or not Hamas is ever at fault for the starvation that's occurring in Gaza, the answer is always no, Israel evil, Hamas good. Have a look yourself.
Would you say Hamas has some culpability in people starving?
No.
Why?
This is
when they spent so much money building tunnels and everything under
so
the
right now, what is going on is a slaughter. All right. And right now, Israel is, with.
And this has led, unfortunately, to the vilification of the hostages. We frequently see things now, such as missing baby photos on the side of lamp poles with Nazi signs drawn on them, as if somehow these babies are monsters for being kidnapped. How dare they? But in any case, the IDF have frequently looked at the starvation campaign done by Hamas and frequently debunked a lot of the information provided. A lot of the so-called individuals that are suffering from malnutrition quite frequently are found to have actually been suffering from pre-existing conditions, and those pre-existing conditions, usually birth defects, were then used to somehow push forward a malnutrition and a death from starvation narrative that the West seems to be so frequently falling for. Examples of these have become all too often to see. Now, there has been significant aid being delivered to Gaza, and I have covered that. In fact, every day we see somebody's dropping aid somewhere, and one has to ask the question, with so much aid being dropped everywhere constantly, how is there still starvation? Now, you will note that in other videos that I've made, I have suggested that one of the issues that Israel says it frequently has is that the aid convoys are frequently taken over by Hamas, with the food being kept either for Hamas fighters or Hamas to be able to distribute as a form of patronage to its own networks. And you can see proof of that right here, where you can see aid convoys all being captured by Hamas. Now, we've also seen in recent days the condemnation of the killing of all those journalists in Gaza in the last few days, and I myself have done a few videos on those. But it's very interesting to see that even the BBC now suggests that apparently said journalist that was killed actually worked for Hamas in their media team in Gaza before the current conflict, which again highlights the question of whether or not the individual was objective. The answer is no, they were clearly heavily biased. Everybody could see that, yet we are still told that they weren't a Hamas operative, they were an independent journalist. Like, yeah, right. In fact, when you actually ask the Foreign Press Association whether or not the said journalist was a Hamas operative, they had this to say.
Frankly, I don't care whether Asharif was in Hamas or not.
So as you can see, they really don't care, because there's a narrative to push, and they want to push that narrative. Now, unfortunately, that narrative is leading to all forms of anti-Semitism. In fact, you can actually see here on the news that River Island, which apparently sponsored or supported Israel, is taking a huge economic hit, which has forced the closures of 33 of its stores across the United Kingdom. And that's all from anti-Semitism and boycotting of Israel stuff because of, Israel got invaded by Gaza, which caused the death of its people on October 7th. Very strange. But what we can see is that this recognition of Palestine is going to be the next big issue. Now, what do I mean by the next big issue? You see, the issue is the discussion around what exactly classes as a Palestinian state. Remembering that the original divide of if you want to call it the Palestinian Mandate was for Transjordan and what is now called Israel. Now, Transjordan was meant to be the Arab section and Israel was meant to be the Jewish section, with actually colonization of the Arabs into the Jewish state occurring and not the other way around. But in any case, what we are finding is that this Palestinian state is due to comprise the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Now, for those of you who don't know what East Jerusalem is, I've got to admit, neither did I. It includes what's classed as the Old City, and that's the Western Wall, the Alaska Mosque, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It also includes surrounding neighborhoods. Now, the neighborhoods aren't that important, but obviously it also includes neighborhoods such as the Mount of Olives. Now, the big issue here clearly is the Western Wall, which obviously to the Jews is their holiest site. So I can't see them wanting to relinquish the Western Wall, the original foundations of the Second Temple, to a foreign entity. I just can't see that happening. So I did actually look up the history of East Jerusalem, and it was very interesting to note that between 1948 and 1967, it was controlled by Jordan after the Arab-Israeli War. Now, Jordan then went one step further, and they weren't really just happy with control of it, and they annexed it in 1950. But this was only recognized by a few countries, a little bit like Russia annexing Crimea. In any case, in 1967, it was captured by Israel in the Six-Day War, along with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, post-1967, Israel unilaterally expanded Jerusalem's municipal boundaries to include eastern Jerusalem and some surroundings of West Bank villages, effectively annexing them, although no country, which includes the US until 2017 when it did, formally recognizing this move at the time as being legitimate. Now, Israel, as of today, still considers Jerusalem its complete and united capital since the 1980s Basic Law, which states that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Now, the Palestinian view is that East Jerusalem is the capital of their future Palestinian state. So it's very easy to say we want that, even though it was never actually occupied by the Palestinians. It was never part of their state, if you want to call it that. It was originally under the control of Jordan, which Jordan then lost following a war. So how does it become Palestinian property? Who knows? Now, that issue itself is problematic because Jordan itself doesn't want to see East Jerusalem going through to a Palestinian authority because, again, they lost it in the Six-Day War. They still consider that they somehow had some right over it. I don't know. In any case, the UN Security Council still considers East Jerusalem to be occupied territory underneath international law, and most countries maintain embassies in Tel Aviv, suggesting that Jerusalem itself isn't Israel's capital. In fact, the only country to formally recognize it was when the previous Trump administration moved their embassy to Jerusalem in 2018. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, recognition of East Jerusalem as part of Israel is extremely limited internationally, and that's ultimately the land that some individuals suggest is, well, occupied. Now, in terms of East Jerusalem, only 38% of the population is actually Palestinian or Arab, if you want to call that. The rest is obviously in Jewish neighborhoods. So one would ask the question, what would happen to these individuals should East Jerusalem find itself being given to a Palestinian authority? Although I cannot see that ever happening. It does look like across the political spectrum in Israel, no one wants to give away the Old City and the Temple Mount. All of them consider it to be far too sacred territory, and all of them say that it's actually a mark of their sovereignty as a nation to retain East Jerusalem as part of their capital, because that's where the Western Wall is. In any case, it's very noticeable that all these countries that want to come out with suggestions of a Palestinian statehood, all of them ignore the boundaries or the markings of where the actual Palestinian state will be. Because one of the key issues between Hamas and any form of negotiation in terms of statehood has always been the status of East Jerusalem. And it's important to recognize that because even Jordan suggests that they do not want Hamas to have any role in terms of the overall control over East Jerusalem and Jerusalem's holy sites. So the Arab world itself is divided on this very topic. But you see, many of these Western nations that now find themselves with sizable Muslim populations feel the need to virtue signal and somehow suggest that they're going to recognize a state that they don't really know what it encompasses. And that in itself is very telling. It's also very telling that one of the very countries that recently said that they would recognize a Palestinian state, Australia, for example, recently had the following Islamic marchers marching through Melbourne chanting, "We are awaiting orders." Have a look. And so one's going to ask the question, awaiting orders for what? In any case, you can let me know what you think of the entire thing in the comments section below. But I've got to say that all this virtue signaling is not going to end well and will not lead to peace in the Middle East, because everybody's just virtue signaling without any detail or any real recognition of what exactly they say and what it might lead to. It's just my views. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.